And that was the first time that I actually heard of the terminology environmental justice. That was the first time that I was able to start making these connections of why is it that a lot of my family members have asthma, where we're experiencing a drought like we've never seen before.
And I think that's one of the main elements that we need to work. It's empowering our community.
If we don't do the work in our own circles, in our own families, in our own neighborhoods, at our own schools, at our own workplaces, on the public bus, at the dinner table, we need to have those conversations first.
This conversation is incredibly important and timely as our nation continues to grapple with the pervasive systemic racism, including in our environmental, energy, and healthcare systems.
Hello, hello. Welcome to Green Table Talk. I am LaTricea Adams. I am going to serve as co-host for tonight's episode, which I'm really excited about. Y'all, we made it through another year of a quasi, is it still here? Pandemic. Excited to see 22 and what happened in the year 2022, but very excited to skate on into 2023. And tonight's episode is focused on just that. What's the tea? What's the green tea? What are the things that we should anticipate, which we should see as it relates to environmental justice policy from a Black and Brown perspective? Far too often when we talk about policy, legislative policy, particularly around environment, I know for me, it gets way too technical. So tonight, we have some experts in the field that's going to be able to break some things down and really help us to go into year 2023, ready to go, ready to fight the power down at the people movements part of this work at the grassroots level. So I'm going to turn it over to tonight's guests. We'll first start with self-introductions with Mr. One and Only Chris Espinosa.
Thank you very much for the invitation, LaTricea. I'm Chris Espinosa. I'm the Director of Outreach and Engagement for Chair Grijalva on the House Committee on Natural Resources. And I'm really excited to be here and have this conversation with you all.
Awesome. Happy to see you. I have to brag on you, Chris, before we get to our next illustrious guest. Y'all, Chris is the man, okay? You can tell that he's a little bit modest, but it has been such a joy seeing some of the work that Chris has done, particularly in the legislative space around environment. So super excited to hear how some of that work should show up as we move into 2023. Our next Firehouse, Black Girl Magic, all of that sprinkled around, the one and only Kari Fulton.
It's good to see y'all. It's very good to see y'all. Very good to be in good company with everyone. Yeah. And so you want to introduce, I apologize. My chalkboard fell off my wall. I was trying to put it back on. You know, I have an accoutrement behind me. And some of it's real, some of it is AI. So, but I wanted to make sure, I work on environmental justice issues and climate justice in particular, especially around federal policy. And I'm really excited to be in this conversation with you. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Always in good company. I like that phrasing. Kari has been a friend and a partner with Black Millennials for Flint since our inception, from working in Ward 7 and Ward 8. If you're in the DC area, you already know what time it is. So excited to be in the virtual space, but still connected in community with Kari. Good to see you as well. So let's go ahead and hop right on into it. All right, so this year in 2022, major moves as it relates to environmental justice legislation. And I want to just focus on that term. It feels good to hear environmental justice legislation. I mean, for years, we've heard, environmental policy, that's a bit more polished and in some instances not really centered at all around the actual environmental justice, the people-centered aspect of this work. So getting down to it, let's talk about the IRA And I'm not going to do the federal type of acronyms for tonight. So let's talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. So we've seen the Inflation Reduction Act, posted all over the media. We've seen it on social media, traditional media, all these different things about the Inflation Reduction Act. What I'd like to engage you all in conversation about is, number one, can you just break down what the IRA or what the Inflation Reduction Act is for someone who is not necessarily familiar? And then also, what do we foresee, particularly as it relates to communities, so Black and Brown communities? What should we be looking for as it relates to the Inflation Reduction Act as it kind of trickles down to the local level? And we can actually start with Kari.
For sure. So, well, I really think that, so as we talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, it is a major aspect of support for infrastructure. There's also a lot of changes to the tax code as far as how things are activated. And I want Chris to go a little bit more in depth because he's on the Hill navigating, and so he can give you all the technical legalese around the Inflation Reduction Act. It also does some major investments into environmental justice. It helps with the investments for Justice 40, which some people may have heard of. If you haven't, Justice 40 is an initiative that says that all funding for climate investments, the overall benefits, at least 40% should go to quote unquote disadvantaged communities. And I know, LaTricea, you've done a great job on the WEJAC supporting a lot of that really important work. But it is a huge climate investment within the Inflation Reduction Act. And also there are some pieces of it, coming from the climate justice perspective that are not enough. And there's also the reality that there are some investments in certain types of fossil fuels and carbon capture and sequestration and some other aspects that are very, very, very controversial. And they may not necessarily benefit our communities, and also continue to invest into industries that we want to get away from. If we want to get into a truly renewable and just green economy. So a lot of people had a lot of issues with that. And, I know other people will dive deeper into that. But what is most important around it is how these investments are going to come down to communities. So when we talk about, okay, you have the infrastructure bill that came out, you have the Inflation Reduction Act that just came out, you have huge investments into really changing over the way that we look at our country right now. Are all neighborhoods going to get equitable treatment? And even when we identify disadvantaged communities and we create new metrics, how do we make sure that we have the checks and balances to ensure those who are most impacted really get the benefits that they need to have? And so that's been a huge struggle. So I'll stop there, but I know that there's so much more that we need to be talking about, and that is going to be critical for making sure that the money that is coming out of these different policies on the federal level actually come down to the communities that need it.
Yeah, that was excellent. And I think Kari did a great job at encapsulating what the IRA really is. If I had to sum it up in a sentence, I would say the Inflation Reduction Act in a climate context is the biggest investment this country has ever made to addressing climate and environmental issues. It's $369 billion dedicated to that effort. It's a combination of tax credits and tax incentives, pollution reduction targets, funding in programs to accelerate the clean energy transition. But most importantly and most significantly, for environmental justice communities, for frontline communities of color, economically oppressed communities, is when you marry that with the administration's goal of ensuring that 40% of the benefits from these climate investments go to those very communities, it has the potential to be a real game changer in marginalized communities across this country. Now, that is not a given. It is still going to take community-based organizations on the ground working with their municipalities, working with their states to ensure that this funding is dispersed in an equitable way, that it goes towards projects that communities support and that communities have input into throughout the process. So it's going to be a long rollout, but it gives every frontline organization on the ground an opportunity to really shape how this funding transforms their own communities in a way that's going to position them for the clean energy economy of the future.
Yes, so you all just dropped all sorts of gems. Thank you so much for really giving that layout of what the Inflation Reduction Act is. I know in the beginning stages of the Inflation Reduction Act, Black Millennials for Flint did some work on the ground, trying to make sure that even the information was digestible for community. So you can very much so, like you mentioned, Chris, we're really working together collaboratively at the local level, particularly with cities, with counties, with municipalities and the like, and then also states. One thing I want to kind of add another layer to this question with, so while we realize, in some states are not created equal, some states are a bit more progressive than others. So like, for example, I think about, for example, in Ohio, where you have cities like Cleveland that are doing this major investment with some of their funding, not specific to the IRA, but just in general, really focus on lead service line replacement, for example, which is something else that came up towards the latter part of 2021, but in implementation year in 2022. What advice would you give to community members on the ground to make sure that this money is going where it's supposed to go? So while it's a beautiful thing, and kudos to Congressman Congressman Raúl Grijalva and team for making sure that this monumental bill like the IRA with the bipartisan infrastructure fund, all of those things came to pass. And I can just start with Kari. Like, what do you think people should do, people power, to make sure, again, while this is major investment, making sure that it does get to the right people that are being disproportionately impacted?
Well, I think there's a couple different ways that I see it happening already. You have some really great programs like the Justice 40 Accelerator. You also have key people who are sending recommendations to the administrations and to the different agencies about how they can make sure that all those different groups, especially those who have been most historically marginalized, can be at the table in a different way. And I really appreciate that. I think what also needs to happen is figuring out the ways, so there's different levels of how communities are impacted by these different projects. There are the nonprofits who would potentially have the opportunity to get funding. There are the school districts, and we're seeing that as well. But you're also going to have lots of projects that are going to be coming down the line, and they have community advisory groups. They have different protocols that they have to get involved in order to get these projects approved. I've been working with some great frontline community members to engage with some of these different federal agencies, including the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, so that people know, how do I even give public comment? We're talking about massive change all over the country. People need to weigh in. And so that's something that we're working on a lot. We actually are going to be out there with some shrimpers on Thursday at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission meeting, and want to continue doing that every month so that more everyday folk know, one, how do I actually engage? Two, where do I have the potential to raise my voice? And three, what is the right way to raise my voice? Because a lot of times we get so caught up in the emotion of the moment that there might be real technical legalese things that need to be brought up, and we might not necessarily know which way to say that. It's all this, did you say the and the or did you just say the or? And I think when we have more of our experts that are able to work with community, that is so key and critical. What I also appreciate is that people are sharing this information cross-wide. So you might have one organization and they get a grant to figure out how do they navigate these different things. And they don't just keep that information to themselves. They're spreading it to every other grassroots organization that they can so that it can go out far and wide. And we need to figure out a way to multiply that and get it out as fast as possible, because we're talking about a complete energy revolution that's going to happen within the next 8 years, because a lot of these goals are set for 2030. So when we think about that, this is a critical time right now. And I know Chris can go in about the EJ for All Act and like how important that is for folk to engage in that process and getting that passed as well. But I'm really excited about it. And I also am excited that so many more of our institutions are getting involved in this. So I have the privilege of adjuncting at Howard in the interdisciplinary environmental studies program. And so that has been really powerful because we're introducing more and more university students. And you have things like the HBCU Climate Change Consortium and so many other projects that are creating professionals who come from frontline communities, who can not only take that expertise, but also their understanding of their own neighborhoods, their own families, and really bring that to the table in a different way. So we have an 8-year time span to change where we're at right now. And I think we're pegged to make it happen.
Yeah, again, I mean, Kari nailed it. The best thing that communities can do right now to prepare themselves for the funding attached to the IRA and the transition that it will engender is to participate in public comment opportunities, in advisory committees, at all levels, from your local municipality all the way up to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. She mentioned the EJ for All Act, and part of the precept that was embedded into EJ for All is the fundamental belief that community-led solutions are the best solutions. And the way we arrive at that is by robust public input and the ability for communities to shape the programs that will impact their lives and their livelihoods. And so, put it another way, nothing about us without us. And that's what communities should be striving for. And the way to achieve that is by engagement at all levels.
Look, Chris, you need to go ahead and coin that and get that on a shirt. Nothing about us without us. That was a whole word. I thank you for sharing that. And I can attest, also to that public contribution component. I'll even take that a step further. So I know many listeners, or if you haven't before, have done public comment for years, decades. And I think for the first time, in my opinion, maybe not as much for the first time, but a bit more widespread, we're starting to see those public comments and contributions actually being materialized. I think that for far too long, people are just tired, right? Like screaming like the same things, because environmental racism, that's one thing that's been consistent. Is how it shows up in Black and Brown communities, have been, screaming for the top of their lungs about what should and what should not be happening. And I think that we are starting to see a shift in how policy is influenced, and even how rule setting, regulations are set. There's so many opportunities, and in my opinion, and from my observation, to actually give input that actually means something, that's showing up, and not necessarily just kind of falling on deaf ears. I hope that we keep that same energy going into 2023, but definitely something that adds a sense of optimism that honestly, but we had not seen as widespread as we are seeing now. So thank you for that. And that's just a plug. Make sure that you follow Black Millennials for Flint. We try as much as possible to share those opportunities where you could provide comment. That's another source of support also, especially to your grassroots organizations, getting people together and mobilizing. That's a job within itself. But then adding on building capacity around how do I advocate? What should I be advocating for? What is the technical knowledge that I need to know? And Kari said, what are the legalities that I need to be privy to? I've also seen there being more support, and even knowing that that's the type of level of support that's needed to push into frontline communities. Baby, if you're living in a frontline community, you're just trying to live every day. So knowing that even the approach of what does EJ look like, what do those resources look like, I think we're turning the corner with that. So going into this next question, so that felt good to open up that way, but let's keep it real, and I'm gonna name names. So with this dirty side deal, I mean, we keep hearing this in the news and headlines. People, are sick and tired of being sick and tired, in the words of my great ancestor, Fannie Lou Hamer, specifically with Senator Manchin, and his approach to this deal, just the impacts for generations that some of these decisions that are still in the gray could potentially have on already vulnerable communities. Chris and Kari, and we can start with Chris. Can you kind of give us, within your framework, what is going on when we see this in the headlines? What are we talking about when we see the dirty side deal? And then what are some potential implications that may have for folks in frontline fence line communities?
Sure. Everything we've just been talking about the importance of public input, about the importance of community-led solutions. The permitting proposal from Senator Manchin is the antithesis of that. The practical impact of what it would do would be to shorten public comment periods, to reduce communities' ability to seek redress in court when there are lapses in procedure or inaccuracies with the information provided to community, to the extent that it's provided at all. Those are some of the elements that are included in Manchin's dirty permitting deal. It is designed to fast track and speed up energy infrastructure, not clean energy infrastructure, energy infrastructure. And so it would have dramatic implications for communities across the country and their ability to have agency within their own communities, and their ability to object to energy infrastructure that has the potential to harm them, to harm their families, to harm their public health, and to depress the ability of communities to thrive. This measure has come up twice now. It has been proposed as an attachment to what's called must-pass legislation. These are pieces of legislation that are so critical to the nation that often they get support where otherwise certain provisions would not. And it's been beat back by the community twice. We just found out this evening that Senator Schumer has offered Senator Manchin yet another vote on his dirty permitting deal, which could come as soon as this Thursday. So it's very harmful to communities. It puts their future and this whole clean energy transition that we're talking about in jeopardy. The good news, though, is that there is something that folks around the country can do about it. They can call their senator right now, today, and share their voices on this. Let their views be known to their elected representatives. It does require a 3/5 majority vote, so 60 votes to pass. And if communities lift up their voice, there's a very strong potential that it could fail yet again. And so those are the stakes.
Yeah, it's a lot at stake. And beyond that, it would allow for expediting some really controversial projects, including the Mountain Valley Pipeline. So that has had activists across the country up in arms. People have been pushing back, which has been super awesome to see. And also to see Chairman Grijalva really leading that effort on the Hill to get other people to stand up and say, we don't want this permit reform. But it came out of the Inflation Reduction Act as a way to get Joe Manchin to agree to this reform. And not to this reform, but to the IRA and passing it. But that doesn't mean anything. We, like Chris mentioned, we have to continue calling our senators every day. We have to be vigilant about our environment. And we also need to remind ourselves that if this passes, all the issues that we're already having with making sure that people can get their voices out is going to be even worse. It's going to shorten time periods for public comment processes. It's going to make it so your ability to sue about certain projects, you won't have as the same amount of time and leeway to be able to do those things. And it doesn't, yes, you could argue against them, but you're going to be working on a really, really short time window. And if you've ever been an organizer and you've been a frontline organizer, you know how hard it can be to just get folk in the room in the first place. So, it's very interesting because the counterattack is they're using renewable energy and they're saying, hey, if we don't get this, this is going to slow down all these other projects that you really want. So you all are really biting yourselves in the back. So I think it's an interesting conversation to continue following.
Oh, yes. So you dropped all of those check around the things that just are not good. Just to be quite frank, just gonna be real. Nothing has run me low, as my granny would say, rest her soul, than Senator Manchin and all of these tactics and antics that literally have antagonized those who are looking to be good stewards of their community. I'm really excited just to kind of piggyback on what Kari said you started with saying like community organizers and activists have been up in arms, and community members. And so I think, from an opportunity perspective, I think having even virtual forums like this, for having community members, that outreach and education component where we are able to clearly articulate like what's at stake, and pair that with, similarly to what Chris shared, like how can we make sure that we are ringing the phones from our respective Congress members, like ringing it off the hook, to let them know that this is something that is very important to their constituents, and that constituent choice. What seems to be the theme for this evening is that public input, I'm going to keep saying this, materialize and really shows up and how people are going to vote. And add another layer in there, push back on him publicly.
Yep.
We see more progressive, members of Congress, and we're going to keep championing Congressman Grijalva. We see him being public and being very front and center and educating his own constituents about what could potentially be at stake. But also, I urge members of Congress, I urge those staffers to be more visible and vocal about what those specific impacts of their constituents, speak and work for your constituents, and what harm may be at stake, along with, a vote and a push in the right direction. So I want to make sure that I spoke to that, is to make sure that in all of this, with community like clapping back, that we have those people who coin themselves as being progressive, that you really show up in a progressive way and don't, fall into the status quo. But thank you for that. Ooh, I got riled up about that one. It's been a rough year with this gentleman, and what he has set out to do. He is really adamant and persistent in this agenda, my word.
Well, LaTricea, I think
So,
one of the things that really
listen.
demonstrates contrast is the approach that my boss, Chair Grijalva, has taken in crafting EJ for all and ensuring that public input matters, that community participation matters, and that those are fundamental concepts to democracy. And if I could just digress a little here and point out that one of the things that the community has expressed is so frustrating with what they see in the Manchin permitting deal is that it's the exact opposite of that. It's a backroom handshake deal between two individuals with no real connection to the kind of communities that we're talking about, with no process, with no hearings, with no debate, and yet that proposal is moving forward. That stands in stark contrast to what we want to see as the future of policymaking. And that stands in contrast to what's reflected in the Environmental Justice for All Act.
Yeah, and to add to that, Chris, I take that personally with somebody doing something against the Environmental Justice for All Act. What is very special, and I would be remiss not to uplift this, is how public comment was taken and contributions for community, specifically for this bill. It literally, y'all, I'm talking about line for line, word for word, a platform in which any community member. So let's kind of focus in on that. So for example, and rest in peace, I should have opened with acknowledging a now ancestor, Congressman McKeechin, who has been so instrumental in this work and this very conversation that we're talking about. To right up until he transitioned to being an ancestor. I have to make sure that I acknowledge that. But with the work of the late Congressman McEachin and Congressman Grijalva, has a actual platform where, again, it doesn't matter, like if you're in Arizona, if you're in Virginia, if you're in Flint, Michigan, if you're in Baltimore, Maryland, like you are able to provide this insight on this bill, which is incredible. Black Millennials for Flint had an opportunity early on to provide that comment. We had young people, to be able to provide comment on that, particularly like, our base in Flint, which is very important, specifically when we talk about environmental justice. So it's really incredible to see that work. But then on the opposite end, like you got this dude that's really trying to impede on all this progress. So that's why, operative word, progressive, you got to make sure, that we have to be up in arms to make sure that we are going to bat in all of our aspects of influence, wherever we have power, that we execute that to the nth degree so that we can protect and preserve the people. So, Chris, thank you for adding that additional piece. And Kari, did you have something else to share too on that?
I just say, follow the money. Something ain't right. I just want to know, what check are you about to get, Manchin? The way that you press it,
baby, the coin must be long because he is persistent.
It must be nice. I just want to know. And where is the ethics committee? Like, where does this come up? And I think it's interesting because there's so much corporate interest in our political theater that we don't oftentimes think about it. And I think what's interesting also is talking with the Office of Public Participation. You see, I can't even get it out. Participation, right? The Office of Public Participation with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. One of the big things that they mention is like, yeah, y'all need to come and talk to us because these companies, they come every day. They make meetings all the time. You can get meetings with these commissioners anytime you want, and they come all the time. And we as frontline folk, especially as community members, we might not have the capacity to be in somebody's face all the time. We're also not getting paid millions of dollars to be in somebody's face all of the time. But there has to be some level of check and balance between that, because we're seeing it play out right now. How much the interests of these different corporate, huge, monolithic, multinational corporations play a role in the decision making. And I want to also lift up this book called Scars on the Land. And I won't go on a rant, but it's an amazing book that I found out from a sister that works with the Descendants Project. She didn't write the book, but she told me about it. And the book basically talks about the environmental impacts of slavery in the South. And one of the key pieces that they talk about in the book is that all these slave owners and these plantation owners, they knew that they were destroying the land by making the tobacco and laying it out and not tilling the land properly. And they didn't care because it was actually cheaper to just go find other land than to take care of the land that they had, right? And the economic and environmental impact of that is just not dived deep enough into. And we're talking about some of the same players, the people who own a lot, who are getting the big money. Do they care about tilling the land properly? No, because to them at this moment, the cost benefit analysis is off. But we know that the long-term impact is bad for all of us. And unfortunately, those who are hurt first and worst tend to look like me and you as well, Chris,
Listen, first of all, I might have been typing kind of loud because I was excited. I Googled that book. I'm going to make sure that is shared out. I immediately was like, yes, this has to go into my collection, both mentally and in a collection of fine books. But yeah, like Kari, you're spot on. I think that kind of goes back to some of the things that we talked about in that first question. Is about money and how are we looking at money? Are we looking at money, especially like in our political sphere? Is it for personal gain? Because again, like, what is going on? Like this, the levels, the audacity that we are seeing to make these side deals. I mean, like, it's really gross. I can't even use euphemisms. If somebody gonna get mad at me for what I'm saying, just be mad, be big mad. But I'm like, is it worth selling your soul? And then, you know, if you want to sell your soul, that's between you and whoever, but like, you got to sell out your own people too. Like, literally going against like even what your own constituents are. That's like bold. That's a different level of bold. But yeah, follow that money. And then the other part I want to uplift that's very important, which goes back to making sure, you know, as there being more resources and provisions for environmental justice, operative word, environmental justice, no shade to environmental organizations, we need those too, but these EJ orgs though, that they have enough funding and capacity to actually go and meet with these people that don't live in their community, right? Everybody can't hop on a plane and fly to DC. That costs money. Everybody, you know, can't be put up like in lodging and the like, you know, until we start to see those resources go down into community. You know, I think that's why it's so critical for there to be voices of people from frontline communities, from people who are in economic distress, where of course, like people from major corporations that's getting this money that we're talking about, this dirty money, this blood money, have the resources to actually remain engaged in these, like you said, handshake type of meetings. Yes. Whew. It's a mess. It's a mess.
It's okay. Tell them to open these doors. Come on, come through and come open these doors.
Open these doors. And I think, you know, at one thing, and I want to uplift Gen Z in the house. Since, you know, millennials, we getting kind of old now. Let me tell you something. If nobody else will drag you in public forum and got that on lock, baby, it's Gen Z. If you do anything that is off, they will drag you. That's all we need is to get the youth engaged. You around here doing stuff that you're not supposed to. If community members are engaging with any of these commissions and you're not responding, but you will respond to a dirty corporation, let's go ahead and put those people on blast, right? So it's a brand new day around what community influence looks like. I see that's the type of stuff that I get jazzed about, that I get chills about, is that clapback from community and how strong it is, and really, you know, talking about community-centered accountability is the real essence of people power. And we're starting to see it. Just like dude done tried twice and he's still trying twice, and we're gonna clap back. You know, every time it's something that clap back, not reflective of community. Like Chris said, like literally this is the antithesis of what people have said. I'm clutching invisible pearls, the unmitigated gall for you to think that that's just gonna go by and it's gonna be cool. Absolutely not. But
I want to lift up the boomers. Like first of all, I love a good intergenerational fight, right?
Yes.
But the 60 and up crowd, the retirees, the folk who's like, I got time today, they are coming out in full force.
Full force.
I have met so many folk who are like, I'm just tired. This is not the world I want to leave for my grandkids. I'm fed up. I'm angry. You know, I want to see something else happen, and I got time. What you need? Who you need me to call? So it's interesting though, because there's also this chasm that happens in organizing with our communication barriers. So you might have two different groups that want the same thing, but they might not communicate on the same platform. So that's been the very interesting dynamic that I think we're all grappling and tackling with, is like, how do we make sure that this message is going out on every different type of platform so it's accessible, intergenerational, And so the revolution can really happen the way that it needs to, where we're passing that baton and continuing to grow, and that people feel seen. So sometimes we get in these spaces and it's so technical and we forget that there is still a digital divide. And that, you know, and some of our communities, they don't have all day Wi-Fi to sit on a 6-hour Zoom conference, you know, but we still need to figure out the best ways for everybody to engage.
Yeah, I always try and uplift what my friend in New York, Elizabeth Yampierre with Uprose says, which is, if we're not doing it intergenerationally, we're failing. And I think that's exactly right. You know, we need to bring everyone together in whatever mediums we have to use to make sure we're exercising our voice in unison. And that's where you create the kind of change that makes a dirty deal no longer a possibility.
Yes. And you know, the intergenerational aspect of this work is what the EJ principles were grounded in. And whether you're Black, whether you're Latinx, whether you're Indigenous, our culture is grounded in intergenerational work, and not even just work, in the way that we love, the way that we commune, all of that, all of those parts. I'm really excited that you all lifted that up. I think, you know, as we talk about a very different approach to environmental justice policy and action, is to break away and dismantle the colonialism that shows up in the process of even establishing how we should be governing ourselves. That should inherently be an intergenerational, a very collaborative, a very intimate, if you will, experience. So you're absolutely right, baby. Let me tell you something. The boomers that have retired, they absolutely have time being like on the hill, like you see it. And I love to see it. And they've been big mad for decades. Like millennials, we've been big mad. We've been grown for a minute. Some of us been grown, you know, for about 20 years. So Gen Z, they almost getting there, but boomers and silent generation, you still have some members of the silent generation that are still about that life and are still very big mad. And I love to see it. I love to see it. And, you know, even from just a spiritual perspective, you know, with it being intergenerational, then we allow grace for our elders when they are tired. They feel comfortable that, you know, we can pass the baton, you know, that we, you know, have an onus as the younger generations to make sure that we are doing the work that they are carrying, that they are trying to bestow to us, right? So yeah, I absolutely love to see it. Let's go ahead and transition, and we're going to shift gears just a little bit. So we talked a lot about the influence from a federal policy and from a legislative perspective, but I want to touch a little bit around rules. So one thing that I personally get really jazzed about is the rulemaking. So just a quick tidbit. And this is the school teacher in me, so it might be annoyed a little bit, but I'm still going to do it anyway. So one key thing to note is when a bill is actually passed and signed into law, like, yay, that's great. But then you have this big other component that includes rules and regs and the like. And that is often left up to respective agencies. So if you don't have that same energy that you had, like when the actual bill was getting passed with that community and public input on the rulemaking side, we're gonna have a problem. I would even dare to say that sometimes with the most progressive and amazing legislation to pass, if you don't have the right rules in place, it literally like does not live up to what the bill was actually set out to do. So I want to speak specifically because, you know, we wouldn't be Black Millennials for Flint if we didn't talk about lead. So one key thing that I know I personally was excited to see both in 2022 But even going back as far as to 2020, in year one of this administration, particularly with EPA, with Administrator Regan, I mean, EPA is on a roll with providing opportunities for public comment. They even have gone on the road, which I've been very excited about. I mean, back in the day, you better just hurry up and make it to DC, baby, if you're trying to make a comment. Of course, like being in a virtual space has made things a lot more accessible. But shout out to EPA. That really has been demonstrating, I would even say for other agencies, around what it looks like to truly garner the input from community and doing it in in different facets, in multiple types of modes and mediums, if you will. So let's talk specifically about the lead and copper rule. Whoo, my. The lead and copper rule has been in need of some work for some time. But it takes a long time to get rules established, especially changes in rules. The lead and copper rule has been around since the 90s, you know, just as surely as it has been around for, you know, over 3 decades. That part to actually make those amendments and be reflective of that whole span of time takes a lot of time. So that being said, we kind of have to wait, you know, until 2024 before we can potentially see what these new rules will be before they're actually rolled out into implementation. But we already see some major issues. So we talked about in 2014, 2015, the wake of the Flint water crisis, but just in 2022, we see similar incidents like we saw in Jackson, Mississippi with the water crisis. So thinking about us kind of having to wait, you know, it kind of is what it is at this point to really see some of that public input to go into effect as it relates to the lead and copper rule. What are some recommendations that you would give to people in community, specifically around water quality? And you know, it's a whole nother conversation to talk about other things that's in the water, because it's not just lead, lifting up PFAS, but that's another topic. But what are some pieces of advice that you would give to community members where they can, at least in the interim, while their rulemaking is still kind of solidifying, make sure that they are still in a position where they can hold their local water utilities accountable, their state oversight, making sure that that's happening with fidelity? What advice would you give?
For sure. I wasn't sure if Chris wanted to jump in before me. This is a great question. I would definitely say we've been talking a lot about the federal level, but so much happens on the local and on the county level. And that also goes into back to what I was saying about, is this infrastructure funding going where it needs to go? So Delaware has a really good oversight committee that they started to develop around Justice 40. So I would say, I really think it would be good for more states to model opportunities like that, to have oversight over where funding goes. When it comes to water, we had a boil water advisory in my neighborhood in Baltimore just recently. And what I thought was most interesting about it is they never really identified what the source of the contamination was, where it was coming from. There were some rumblings about maybe because they were doing construction in the area that might have impacted, some of the pipes and the system, but I'm not sure if that was confirmed or not. And our council member Costello has been really pushing forward and trying to get more investigations. So your local politicians, they have so much that's going on, but the more that you're able to push them on some of these different things when it comes to environmental regulations and mandates for your local area, the better. Oftentimes there's so much going on and we assume that the federal government knows what's happening, or that the state government knows what's happening, and that they're somehow talking to each other all the time. And oftentimes that's not happening. So we even have, there's a coalition now that's trying to urge Baltimore to apply for funding around the diesel bus initiative, right? So you could be doing the same things when it comes to infrastructure for water, and really starting to prepare for that. The other thing I would say is, like, 2024 is also an election year. So that makes me super nervous, because if we're waiting until then, and then the administration changes and our power structure changes, how do we ensure that this can get really pushed through and solidified in a real way? Because a lot of this is moving through executive actions, and not necessarily on the congressional level. So I'm wondering, Chris, if you have some thoughts, feedback on that part too.
On the implications of the timing in 2024, I'm not really sure that I do. I think, just like we've been talking throughout, and LaTricea, you absolutely pointed out that a lot of times the specificity that we want to see is not included in the underlying legislation that creates our environmental and public health laws. We do really rely on agencies to craft the specifics of how those programs and policies are going to work out, and they revise those from time to time. Both of you are far more expert on this than I am, but just as a general matter, I think we all naturally assume that what's coming out of our tap is going to be safe, and if it's not, somebody will tell us. And that isn't necessarily the case with our regulations around safe drinking water, and clean water in general. And so, I think the more that folks can both engage at a local level, talk to their water utility providers, get specifics about what they're doing to ensure public safety and health, and how those programs actually work on the ground, the more able we will all be to weigh in on regulations like the lead and copper rule when it comes up for revision. And so, that's my best advice. But I think, as LaTricea can tell everyone far more articulately than I can, there is no safe level of lead. And as long as it is in our water infrastructure in any way, shape, or form, it is a threat to public health.
Ooh, what is our consumer rights? Sorry, that just made me think about it. It's like, shoot, we might just do better, how we got to move this money around. So can we get a wholesale on some water purifiers? How does that work?
I think so two things, and that goes back to some additional rules, like the amount of time that cities, municipalities, states, that timeline that they have to spend all this money down, with not necessarily having all of the other surrounding rules in place. That kind of makes things a little bit stressful. I really wish that things could be formalized in at least 2023. That really makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable, with 2024 kind of being like the ending point with that. But what I would recommend, to those who are listening on tonight, and thank you to Kari for uplifting work in Delaware. I also want to uplift some work in my hometown, whoop whoop, in Memphis, particularly with the county mayor of Shelby County, Lee Harris. So back in 2019, actually in 2018, when he was state senator, he introduced a bill making it mandatory for testing for lead in school drinking water. Now, that is not mandatory. That is not mandatory. It's not a federal mandate within the United States. I know back when he actually introduced this bill, it was barely 8 states where that was actually a requirement Even the state of Michigan, y'all, it's not mandatory. In Michigan, it's not mandatory. And so he introduced this bill in the state of Tennessee. In the state of Tennessee, Tennessee is not that progressive at all. And it passed. And it passed. I know I like the reactions to that. And so after he served as being a state senator, he is now currently the county mayor. And so he also established what's called the Shelby County Lead Prevention and Sustainability Commission. And part of the first marching orders with that commission was to make sure that the implementation of that bill when he was state senator, that it was implemented with fidelity. Y'all, this is the first time we ever saw something like this in the county's history in the state of Tennessee, where it is community appointed. There are no people from industry on this particular commission. Even in the resolution, it has the types of people that should be represented on this commission. So it has like healthcare professional, a school board member, someone from a water supply, company, local company or what have you. But I think that kind of speaks to that people power again, and something that can happen at the local level that does have that direct connection to federal policy. So even if you do get something passed at the local level, you can always advocate for like a partner bill that supports something that is a mandate or something that is a recommendation from a federal agency. But just wanted to lift that up as an example. So this conversation, go ahead, Kari.
No, I just think that's powerful, and we need more of that. And all the time local policy turns into federal policy. So much of it is modeled after the things that happen on the local level. So I want to learn more about it, because I'm like, how do we get that?
Yes, let's get offline. I'm really excited. I honestly think that they don't realize how big of a deal that is, like how rare that is. And honestly, that commission was modeled from the state of Baltimore. The state of Baltimore has a state level commission, but it hits differently because it's local. When it's at the state level, from what I've seen from that particular state commission, they're able to provide recommendations that more so impact the state, that could, potentially like impact like state level legislation and even allocation of funding. But when you talk about implementation, that's the part where even we know that states don't necessarily get that right. But when you focus down where it's in community that is guiding what their perspective is around implementation, that's a game changer too. But happy to talk about that. Shout out again to my mayor, Lee Harris and team. But yeah, thank you for engaging in that. So y'all are so dope. I'm like, I really don't want to wrap this up, but we gotta wrap it up. So before we actually end, I want to say thank you to our guests, Chris Espinosa, as well as Kari Fulton. And just before we say farewell for tonight, we always ask our guests to just leave one more gem. What's one call to action that you will leave with anybody at the sound, our sound of our voices this evening? And we could start with Chris.
Oh man, that's a tall order to leave just one gem.
You got
it. I would say it's easy to look at the daunting tasks ahead of us and say, my voice doesn't matter. But when we collectively come together and exercise our voice, the one thing that I've learned from my boss, Chair Grijalva, is that the community's voice is far more powerful than we can ever imagine. We just have to work together and support each other to use it.
Yes, I knew you was gonna come with it, Chris. Yes, that was a word. Kari?
A whole word. Oh man. I've been thinking a lot about this, and I think it's important for people to not to lean into the opportunity and the challenge. A lot of times we lean into the doubt. And as soon as you say that you're not going to do something, you're not going to do it, whether it's good or bad. But the more that you lean into the possibility, the more you move with possibility. And we have a lot of possibilities to change the way that this world looks. We have a lot of possibilities to get more potential strength for our loved ones and for our communities, and to really have a system that works differently and better for all of us. But we just have to lean into it. And the more we lean in, I think the stronger we'll be.
Yes, well, it has been an absolute joy having these phenomenal guests. Y'all in Tribe. Anytime that you convene with Black Millennials for Flint, we think you're good people, so you're still in Tribe. So while we may be ending this conversation, it's just one of many as we continue to get into good trouble. Thank you so much for those who joined us tonight for episode 3. We're in season 3, y'all. I can't believe that. It's been 3 years. Whoop, whoop. Episode 3 of Green Table Talk. Until next time, we'll see you again in January. Y'all have a good night.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.